we're going to take you through a tutorial on how to make kombucha from start to finish. So we'll take you through our process, how we've made it in the past. We don't have any currently started, so we need to start from scratch and make our own SCOBY. We've done it with just a store-bought raw organic kombucha in the past. So GTs is what we've typically used. And all I've done so far since buying this was just crack the lid. So we crack the seal, and I don't remove the top. Just leave it loose and leave it like this out on the countertop for a few days, up to a week. And what you're looking for is a SCOBY to start. And that's what you can see right there. So that's a nice SCOBY that's started in this raw organic kombucha. Hopefully you can see that. But that'll be our starter culture. You can buy starter cultures on Amazon and everything. They're fine. I've never purchased any of those because it's way easier and more convenient just to go to the store and buy a bottle of kombucha. So the first step really is getting all your ingredients out and all your equipment ready. We use a 1 gallon jar, and right now inside the jar I just have some isopropyl alcohol just to keep it clean, and we'll be using that to sterilize a lot of the other equipment as we go through here. The next thing that you'll need is the tea that you're going to be using. We use a combination of green tea and black tea. Just any of the store-bought teas are fine. And the amount of tea and the combination you use is really just preference. We have found that the ratio of 5 black tea to 3 green tea bags per gallon, and we're making 1 gallon of kombucha today, we find that works pretty well for us. So in general, your ratios are going to be, for 1 gallon of kombucha, which is a 1 gallon jar, you'll need 1 cup of sugar and about 6 or 7 tea bags, however strong you like it. So we're going, now that our water is boiling, and you don't have to boil a full gallon of water, we just have a small pot of water boiling. We'll make up the difference with just some regular tap water after the fact. So what I do first is get all your tea bags opened up and tied together. That just makes it easier to remove after they're done steeping. So once it's boiling, I'm going to take it off the heat and add in my tea bags and let those sit for about 10 minutes. So while we're waiting for our tea to steep, we'll make sure our jar is nice and clean, just with some dish soap, and then I add isopropyl alcohol to it and give it a nice swirl around, make sure it touches all the surfaces. And I use paper towel just to get a little bit on it, and make sure you rinse down the outside with some isopropyl alcohol, just to make sure we don't have anything to start. Then we can dump that and let that dry while we're letting that tea steep. You also do want to wipe down any utensils that you use to stir the tea with the same isopropyl alcohol that you used to wipe out the inside of the jar with. Alright, now that our tea has been brewing for 10 minutes, go ahead and take the tea bags out. Just that's in there. And then while it's still hot, we'll add our 1 cup of sugar. Just use a pure cane sugar. You just want to get that nice and dissolved in there. Now we will wait till that cools down so it doesn't crack the jar when we put it in. Make sure to compost your tea leaves. Alright, now that our tea has cooled off to a more reasonable temperature and we're not going to crack our jar as soon as we pour it in, we'll go ahead and transfer that right into our jar. And this is where we're going to make up the rest of our gallon by just adding some water to it. Just be right out of the tap. As long as you have clean water. We're on a well system, so we don't have any chlorine to worry about or anything like that. It's going to inhibit the growth of the bacteria or yeast. I'm going to leave a little bit of headspace in there because we're going to be adding that jar of the raw organic kombucha. And these little temperature labels, they're not necessary, but they give you a rough estimate on the overall temperature. Alright, so now that our temperature gauge is telling us that it's at a reasonable temperature, not to kill our bacteria and yeast that is in the just store-bought kombucha, we'll go ahead and add that in now. And you really only need to add the SCOBY. I just add the entire jar, just to give it a good boost. Add all the little bits that are down on the bottom, just to add as much yeast and bacteria as we can. And that brought it up to a nice level. You don't want to go past this kind of tapering portion of the jar, because then your SCOBY that forms in the first little bit of this liquid will be a little bit pinched and a little bit smaller. So just to have the most surface area for the SCOBY to form. And I use a coffee filter just over the top, just to make sure no fruit flies get in there or dust and mold spores get in there. And just use a rubber band just to hold that in place. We'll follow up with you for the next step in the process as soon as we get a good SCOBY formed, about a week or so. Alright, so after 1 week, this is what your SCOBY should look like. So now we're going to bottle the kombucha that's now under the SCOBY, and we're going to reuse the same jar and fill it up exactly like we did the first time, but instead of using that bottle of the store-bought kombucha, we're just going to add in this SCOBY along with about 2 cups of the original tea that's in here. So we'll go ahead and take out the SCOBY. You want to make sure your hands are nice and clean. But at this point, with a well-formed SCOBY, it should be pretty resistant to a lot of bacteria and most funguses, although that's something that you're going to have to keep an eye on. So this is a nice bowl, so we'll just save that there. Then I have just a glass that's also been cleaned that I'll save about 2 cups in. And that's about 2 cups there. We'll wait and pour that back into the jar once we fill it back up with tea. And for the rest of this, we'll go ahead and put it in bottles. I think a pitcher makes it a lot easier. So we'll put it into one of these pitchers just to pour it into the bottles. And then there is going to be some yeast that's settled out to the bottom. You do want to get that in there because that's going to aid in the second fermentation in the bottles. So I gave it a nice swirl. Make sure you get all that in there as well. Come back for the rest. So onto the bottles. We just reuse these ones that you can get from the store, the ones like we started the SCOBY with initially. So we'll get the bottles all nice and clean, which we've already done. And from here, you can flavor it with whatever you want. Today we're going to be using some lavender and a little bit of sugar. And we're mainly using that sugar in this bottle because we're not using fruit or other things that have sugar in it already. If you do use pureed fruit, which is really popular, you might not even have to have any sugar at all. The lavender flowers that we're adding don't have any sugar in them, so we're going to add about a spoon of sugar, and this is about a 16-ounce bottle here. Alright, so we'll get the sugar and lavender flowers in now. About a teaspoon of sugar per bottle. That's about right. And then we'll add some lavender flowers. How much you add just really depends on how flavored you want it. We're going to add a pretty good amount to these bottles. We have our bottles that have the sugar and lavender in them. So now we'll just fill them all the way up with the kombucha. So we'll now let these sit out at room temperature for about 3 or 4 days, and during that time they will bottle condition, so the yeast and bacteria that are in here are going to continue to do what they were doing in that jar, although now all of that carbon dioxide that's being produced by the yeast will be trapped in here because it's a sealed bottle. So these bottles that you use will have to be able to withstand the pressure that does build up. So any of the bottles that you can use for brewing beer, there will be those the swing top bottles work well, but we find these work just fine, and we know that they're well rated for that pressure because they already had kombucha that was under pressure in them. Alright, so now that we have the bottles all taken care of, we will remake the kombucha the same way that we made last time, although we will use this SCOBY that we collected and a little bit of tea that we saved already to remake the new batch instead of using the jar from the store. Alright, so now we'll let this sit for another week and redo that process all over again to get some new jars. One thing you may want to consider is fermenting these in a 5-gallon bucket, just in case one of these bottles does explode on you, it doesn't make a mess everywhere. If you leave them out on your countertop, you can just risk one of these exploding and leaking all over your kitchen. After those 3 days at room temperature, you can put these in the refrigerator, and cooling them down completely stops the yeast from producing any more carbon dioxide, and it will be ready to drink once it's cooled off. You can, at that point, try one of them. So crack it open and see if you like the amount of carbonation that's in them. If you don't think it's quite enough, you can take the remaining bottles back out of the refrigerator, keep them at room temperature for another 1 or 2 days, and then put them back in and retry it that way.